let's explore how you can use Dockerfiles and Docker Compose to customize your dev containers in VS Code. Dev containers provide a consistent and reproducible development environment and work by running a Docker container. Now, for simpler configurations, you don't really need to do much with Docker in order to get started. This is because a lot of the container build configuration is abstracted out by simply referencing an image in the devcontainer.json file. But if you're looking for a more customized dev container setup, or are just someone who really loves Docker, then you've probably wondered how you can use Docker more in your dev containers. If that's you, then you're in the right place. Because in today's video, I'm going to show you how to further customize your dev containers by using Dockerfiles, Docker Compose, and even a combination of both. Everything I'm going to go over is available in this dev container guide, so make sure to check that out. Let's start off by seeing how you can incorporate a Docker file into your dev container. A Docker file is a file that contains the instructions for building an image. They are a great way to extend images, add additional packages, and make minor edits to images. To start, in VS Code, with the dev containers extension installed, run the dev containers add dev container configuration files command. This will show a list of available dev container definitions that you can use for different tech stacks. I'm going to select the Ubuntu container. This will generate a .dev container folder with a devcontainer.json file in it. When we inspect the devcontainer.json file, we see that it simply has a name and an image property that references this container image. Instead of directly referencing the image in the devcontainer.json, I'd rather reference a Docker file, which will build the specified image and install a package. So let's see how we can adapt this to use a Docker file instead. First, I'm going to create a file called Dockerfile. In it, I'm going to specify the base image that I want to use, which will be that same Ubuntu image. Then I'm going to install GIMP, which is a package used for graphic editing. Next, I'm going to head back to my devcontainer.json and remove the image property. Instead, I'll add the build Dockerfile property. Here, I'll specify to use the Docker file that I just created, and since I placed the Docker file in the same path as my devcontainer.json file, I can simply reference it as Dockerfile. And that's it. Now, when I go to start my dev container, the Docker file will automatically be built, and I'll have my image with GIMP installed. There are a lot of other devcontainer.json properties that you can leverage with Docker files, all of which can be found in the dev container open specification documentation. While we just saw how to create a Docker file from scratch, you can always reuse any Docker file that you already have. And you can use a Docker file when authoring an image that you can share with others, known as a pre-built image. We have an entire video on pre-builds if you'd like to learn more. Let's check out another way you can further customize your dev container with Docker Compose. Docker Compose is a great way to define a multi-container development environment. Rather than adding things like databases to your Docker file, you can instead reference existing images for these services in a single YAML configuration file and focus your dev containers content on tools and utilities needed for development. To see this in action, let's again start with our image-based devcontainer.json file. I'm going to create a dockercompose.yaml file in the same directory. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the configuration into here, then we'll go over it. So Docker Compose will list the different services that we want to have in our environment. So in this case, we want to have a tech stack that includes our dev container and a Postgres database. In the dev container properties, we will reference that same image that we've been using. This volume's workspace's cached value will mount the workspace folder from the local source tree into the dev container. The network mode service DB value puts the dev container on the same network as the database so that it can access it on localhost. And the sleep infinity command will keep the container alive until we tell it to stop. And this DB section uses the Postgres image with a few settings configured, so Docker Compose will know how to configure our Postgres instance in our environment. Now, we need to reference this dockercompose.yaml in the devcontainer.json. We'll remove the image property and replace it with a few different properties. First, the Docker Compose file, which will be the dockercompose.yaml that we just created. The service property, which indicates which service in the dockercompose.yaml is the dev container, and we named that service dev container. And the workspace folder, which indicates where to mount the workspace folder. And the open specification once again has a lot of great documentation on the devcontainer.json properties you can use with Docker Compose. Now when the dev container is started, we have our Docker container configured with the Postgres database and dev container image. Now, let's see how you can seamlessly combine these two scenarios by using a Docker file with Docker Compose. If we look at this dev container created from the Docker Compose, we can see that GIMP is not installed. So I'm going to take that same Docker file that we created in our first demo and reference it in the dockercompose.yaml file so that we can have that package installation. To do so, we can replace the image property in the dockercompose.yaml with the build property. This then has a nested property for context, which will have the value of dot to indicate that the Docker file is in the same directory as the dockercompose.yaml, and the Dockerfile property, which will have the value Dockerfile, since that's the name of our file. You do not need to make any additional changes to the devcontainer.json. As we've gone through each of these scenarios, notice how the devcontainer.json still stays simple and streamlined. When we rebuild the dev container, this now combines the power of our Docker Compose configuration with our Dockerfiles custom image build. Dev containers are a powerful tool that enable you to have a consistent development environment that can be spun up almost instantly. Today, we learned how to leverage Dockerfiles and Docker Compose to take your dev containers customization to the next level. To learn more about everything you can do with dev containers, make sure to head over to the containers.dev site for helpful guides and documentation. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can watch our other videos showcasing how to make the most of your dev containers. Happy coding!